I am pleased to introduce Dr. Rita Redberg, who is our keynote speaker for this symposium. Dr. Rita Redberg is a renowned cardiologist who studies the regulatory process for medical devices and the strength of evidence that supports them, particularly high-risk devices, both before and after they are marketed. She has testified before Congress multiple times on these issues. And she was the editor-in-chief of JAMA Internal Medicine from 2009 to 2023, which is an incredible medical journal. So to have the editor-in-chief of that journal for so many years, who's really worked on FDA issues for so long and so deeply here, it brings me joy and is a huge asset to the symposium and to all of our learning. There's a lot more I could say about Dr. Rita Redberg, but instead I'd like to welcome her to the podium.
This is good. Thanks so much, Daniel, for the invitation to be here, and to everyone here in the audience and anyone virtually. It's been great discussions, and certainly the FDA has been an area of interest of mine, and I'm sure many of you, for many years, and we are living in interesting times. So I just wanted to talk sort of an overview of how I'm a general cardiologist at UCSF. I'm still seeing patients. I had clinic yesterday, which has, I enjoy seeing patients, but it's also incredible to me to see kind of the disconnect between what I know is the evidence for a lot of our practices, and in cardiology, we use a lot of high-risk devices, and what patients and even my colleagues think is the evidence. So I got interested, I'll just say, in particular in medical devices part of FDA regulation about 20 years ago, when one of the medical students at UCSF, and it is the great part about being in a university is that you have a lot of trainees and people that are really interested, and I think maybe Mike Inche is here in the audience, but there are a lot of former UCSF trainees that are now going out and doing great work everywhere. One in particular, Sanket Dhruva, who is still at UCSF and now on our faculty, and I decided to look at the quality of evidence that supported high-risk medical devices, because about half of the medical devices that get approved are cardiac devices. So Sanket and I looked and expected that we would find very high-quality evidence for these high-risk devices because they go through the pre-market approval pathway. You know, only a few % of all devices go through pre-market approval. Is considered incredibly rigorous. I actually had been appointed to the FDA cardiovascular device expert panel about a year before we started this study. And so I had access to the proprietary documents that the public doesn't see. But for the study, we did use the summary of safety and effectiveness data that is publicly available. But I will just say that I was sent all of the files so that I could be sure there was nothing in the non-public files that would contradict what we had found, and there was not. So what we found, and this was published at the end of December in 2009, that actually 2/3 of pre-market approval have only one study, which was a stark contrast, particularly then, to the standard that everyone thought applied, which was generally for drugs, was to have 2 randomized control trials, because if you only have one study, it's a lot harder to be confident about that result. We also found that a very low percentage, only 27%, were actually randomized. Studies either didn't have a control group or they used what was called historical controls, which I had never even heard of before. And at this point, I've been practicing cardiology for 20 years. historical controls are comparing to some already published study in a different group and comparing to the group that you're looking at. And only 15% were blinded, which is particularly important for device studies because there's an incredible placebo value to a procedure. And people have like a 60% response rate just from having a sham procedure. So it's so important to be sure to have a blinded, which means a sham or a placebo procedure arm. So we published the study. I had shared, what we were doing and actually had included FDA staff in our work, although when it became clear what the results were looking at, the FDA staff withdrew from this paper. And this was, as I said, our finding. We found that the studies that support these high-risk devices have characteristics that reduce the strength of the evidence and make them prone to bias. As I mentioned, the lack of randomization. Most of them use surrogate endpoints, so not clinical endpoints. So you would be looking at a lab value or an image, but not something that a patient would actually feel. There's what they call training patients, which people don't really talk about, but they're also called roll-ins. And the idea is that, everybody has to learn how to do a new procedure, fair enough. So they would just exclude those patients from the results of the study, which obviously made your study look better when you excluded. And there wasn't a preset number. It was until that investigator at any individual institution felt comfortable and wanted to start including the patients in the study. And the data was not available for what they call training patients. Yet, of course, once the FDA approves a device and insurers cover it, we can't exclude training patients from the results. And doctors don't generally share with patients that, oh, you're the first person I'm doing this on, and results may not be as good as a more experienced operator. And then, of course, as is pervasive in medicine, there was underrepresentation of women and racial and ethnic groups from the device studies. So this came out as a short between Christmas and New Year's in 2009. I remember it well because we actually were in New Zealand on a family vacation, and I was talking to the New York Times reporter from some remote spot there. But I was talking to the New York Times reporter because the FDA totally trashed our study. They had the results beforehand. Anyway, I won't go into all the details. Someone wants to talk to me later. I just won't have enough time. But this was the mass device, which is still kind of one of the industry rags, although not as high profile as Stat Health News. But it's not often that a few doctors ensconced in the ivy towers of academia can get a lumbering dinosaur like FDA to turn on a dime, let alone between Christmas and New Year's. But that's, they said, what happened with this study. But what they did was, I won't read you the whole thing, but you can get it from the first line. FDA has serious concerns with the approach of the Druva study. And they went on basically to attack the study. And they actually said that, among other things, that they had non-public data that would question our results, which they knew that I had reviewed the non-public data and there was nothing in there. But I had asked permission to the FDA to mention that in the article, and they said, no, we would never do anything to upset our industry sponsors. So that was kind of been my concerns about FDA and the quality of evidence since I started looking at it. And I will say that over the last 20 years, things have unfortunately not gotten better. When there is more attention to the issues and the concerns about evidence, things can improve somewhat. But then there are a lot of very powerful forces that have a lot of money, the medical device industry, the professional societies, and the doctors' associations that are all sort of see things other ways and talk about how important it is to get innovative devices to patients quickly. Though I think you could substitute dangerous devices if you're talking about things that have not been studied in randomized clinical trials, and we're looking at high-risk, often implanted devices. So for these pre-market approvals, which are rigorous, They usually require clinical trials, not always. You can use pre-approval, and then there's a new term. It was a new term since when I started looking, the total life cycle, the idea that, well, if you didn't get the studies done pre-approval, then post-approval, you can still collect data. And post-approval is an incredibly weak part of the system, which I think perhaps the next panel will talk a little bit about. And then in 2016, and under the Obama administration, the 21st Century Cures Act further lowered pre-approval evidentiary requirements and said that you could basically get things to market quickly because of the cures, and that we would collect data post-market. However, there has been no increase in post-market surveillance, and in fact, it has just gotten weaker since this legislation passed almost 10 years ago. And then besides the pre-market approval for devices, there's the 510K pathway. So in the 510K pathway, the device just has to meet the criteria of being substantially equivalent to some other device whose safety and effectiveness has never been assessed. That pathway is used for 99% of the devices on the market, for nearly all Class 2, the moderate risk, and some Class 3 devices. And the device just has to be deemed safe and effective, but does not require any clinical data for that determination. So companies, of course, much prefer this. It's a much faster pathway. But it's not just companies that prefer this. The FDA prefers this because it's a much lower burden, and it takes much less staff just to determine that something is substantially equivalent. And the FDA is certainly under-resourced, and was even before the current administration and the cuts. This is just an example of what we call the 510K daisy chain. And so you can see that there's that device over there on the top that got the approved, I think this was a mesh. And what is in that daisy chain is all what's called the predicate devices. So those are all the devices that this clearance, it's not an approval, it's a clearance, was based on, because there was no review, so the FDA doesn't formally call 510Ks an approval. And as you can see, the red is recalled devices. So you can get on the market currently by being substantially equivalent to a device that was recalled because it was dangerous. And that's still allowed in the 510K pathway. And so the FDA did ask the Institute of Medicine to review the 510K pathway back in 2010 and advised the FDA on how the 510K pathway could be made more safe and effective. And after 2 years of careful study and lots of consideration by experts and talking to experts, the Institute of Medicine, now known as the National Academy of Medicine, concluded that the 510K clearance process is not intended to evaluate the safety and effectiveness of medical devices, with some exceptions, and that the process cannot be transformed into a pre-market evaluation of safety and effectiveness as long as the standard remains substantial equivalence, because there is no requirement for safety and effectiveness for a substantial equivalence determination. The FDA, there was rumors, at least I heard, that this report had been leaked to the device industry prior to its publication. The day it was published, the FDA device director, Jeff Shuren, who resigned last year, dismissed the report and said the FDA would never abandon the 510K clearance process. So I'm going to move on and just spend a few more minutes talking sort of on where we are since that time and what's been happening. But just it's always, I think, helpful to think about the history of the FDA. And I think it does explain some of why, in my opinion, the device regulations are even weaker than the drug regulations, although I think the evidence standards could certainly be improved for both of those in order to protect patient safety. But as you know, the FDA was started in 1938 by the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And then I'm just going to go up to skip 62, but the 1976 was the medical device amendments. That was when FDA first started regulating devices. So it was after when FDA started regulating drugs, which was back in 1938. And so there were already devices on the market, which is some of the reason why the 510K clearance pathway was considered to be a temporizing measure until the FDA could review all of the devices already on the market. In 1990, there was a Safe Medical Devices Act, which gave the FDA the authority to recall devices, but it's very rarely exercised. The FDA almost never recalls a device, and again, could be a whole nother conversation. And then, as I already mentioned, the 21st Century Cures Act was passed in 2016, and that really lowered the bar further in terms of evidence. It introduced the Breakthrough Program for devices, which I think you've heard a little bit already about the Breakthrough Program for drugs, or you will, but this introduced it for devices. Before the legislation was passed and signed by President Obama, Sanket, and I did write an op-ed in the New York Times because we had a lot of concerns about the idea of calling things breakthrough and speeding them through, which is the idea of the 21st Century Cures Act. There's always a lot of talk, innovation, breakthrough, which always sounds very good. However, the legislation defines breakthrough very loosely, which we said creates a perverse incentive for manufacturers to use this term to take advantage of a faster approval process and simultaneously use it as a marketing gimmick. And I do think that is what's happened, and there has been a skyrocketing use of the breakthrough designation program for devices since it was authorized in this 2016 legislation. The actual language in the act, which you can see here, allows for increased use of surrogate endpoints and real-world evidence to support approvals, and again says there'll be increased reliance on post-approval data for high-risk devices. And I'm sure many of you in this room are aware that there's now a bill in Congress called something like Allowing Medicare Beneficiaries Access to Innovative Technologies, or some kind of bill with a title like that had a hearing last week in the Health Subcommittee on Energy and I think it was Energy and Commerce, and has bipartisan support. And this bill would say that any device that the FDA gives this very loose breakthrough designation to would get guaranteed Medicare coverage for 4 years, no questions asked, no post-market surveillance. And I'm very concerned this bill is about to end up as law. And there have been studies. This was a study published in JAMA by Aaron Kesselheim and colleagues. What does a breakthrough therapy mean? This was, I believe, for drugs, but it's also true for devices, that most doctors think that a breakthrough designation means that it had a major advance over other treatments. And more than 50% of physicians incorrectly thinks breakthrough means that it requires strong evidence, like randomized trials, where actually breakthrough means that you can use surrogate endpoints, which are not meaningful at all to patients, but faster and cheaper from the industry sponsor. And that in a separate study, they also showed that the public also thinks breakthrough is a positive designation and means that the drugs were effective and supported by strong evidence. But actually, as I said, it means really just preliminary evidence. So this is the expedited approval program. And as you can see, it says it's supposed to be for devices that provide for more effective treatment of diagnosis or life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating diseases. But unfortunately, the criteria, as I said, is much looser than that. And if you look at the list, it's kind of shocking. And in fact, a lot of the most recently designated breakthrough devices, and there actually is a great list that I think Katie Palmer at STAT put together on their website, of what has gotten a breakthrough designation in the device program, a lot of them are 510K devices, which by definition mean that they have to be claiming to be substantially equivalent to something already on the market, yet they're also going for and got a breakthrough designation from the FDA. And the criteria is just that this new novel technology has the potential to lead to a clinical improvement, which I think we would all agree is a pretty loose criteria. And then there are just a lot of new pathways. After you get a breakthrough designation, you can get an accelerated approval pathway, and that again allows for approval based on surrogate endpoints, with the idea that later confirmatory trials will show clinical benefit. Unfortunately, the confirmatory trials are often delayed or not even started, and when they are started, half of them are completed at least 3 years post-approval, so that means you have now a device on the market that was kind of rushed onto the market on the basis of lab values or images or some kind of non-clinical measure, and there is absolutely no clinical data for 3 years while patients are getting this device that is of unclear benefit and of unclear safety and effectiveness. Over 25% of treatment initiations for cancers between the 2009 and 2022 that were for accelerated approval because they were thought to be very promising were later withdrawn from the market. So just showing that having the potential is not any predictor of actual safety and effectiveness or patient benefit. This was another study from Aaron Kesselheim's group showing that of the completed confirmatory studies, and a lot are not completed or not even required, they often continue to use surrogate measures and thus are not actually showing patient benefit. I think the next panel is going to talk about funding and user fees. So in conclusion, I think in order to really protect patients, and the reason I got interested in devices is because I think a big part of why we spend so much more money on healthcare per person in this country and yet have very poor access to healthcare and outcomes that are much worse than countries that spend half of what we do is because we spend a lot of money on very expensive healthcare that is not helping patients or actually killing them. And unfortunately, the killing them part requires that we have better post-market surveillance, and that's kind of what my research is focused on now, is trying to strengthen our post-market surveillance system, which is why it's particularly disturbing to have this bill now going through Congress that would not even require post-market surveillance of these, quote, breakthrough devices. But it's really important to understand and to talk about, because we also don't cover medical device regulation in any of the medical education curriculums. As I said, when I started looking at this, I was already 20 years into my cardiology practice where we were using these devices every day, and I assumed that there was high quality evidence of safety and effectiveness. And our group, Sanket, actually Aaron Kesselheim and I and others, did a survey and surveyed physicians on what their understanding was of the quality of evidence for device approvals, and it is shockingly low. I mean, in like 20%, which was we published. But what we're now trying to do is start a medical education curriculum, which is very rewarding. We have a course now at UCSF where we teach the medical students, and we have another seminar where we teach the residents, and another one for our fellows. But it hasn't gotten sort of national traction. If anyone wants to talk to me about it, we'd love to share our curriculum, because I think it's really important that both patients and physicians understand that a lot of the even high-risk implanted devices on the market have not been shown to be safe and effective, and how important it is for our own health, our safety, patient benefit, and also for the financial solvency of our healthcare system to make sure that things are safe and effective before they reach market, because at that point it becomes like a speeding train, especially because Medicare pays very handsomely for most of these devices once they're implanted in patients. Procedures are reimbursed way higher than medical care and talking to patients, which is, I think, part of why we've shifted that way. So anyway, as you can tell, there are a lot of aspects of this conversation, and I just wanted to kind of give an overview of the highlights of what I think is so important and what I think we need to be thinking about going forward, which is really improving pre- and post-market quality of evidence for devices. Thanks so much for your attention.